The sun had turned vicious by mid-afternoon, baking the trail into hardpan that cracked underfoot like old bone. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste, and the wind carried nothing but heat and the smell of sage. This was the kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes, didn't even acknowledge them. It just took what it wanted and moved on. Elena Mercer lay face down in that dust, her cheek pressed against ground so hot it should have burned. But she couldn't feel it anymore, couldn't feel much of anything except the steady throb behind her eyes, and the wet heat spreading across her ribs where something inside had gone terribly wrong. Her dress, once a respectable navy cotton, the kind a bank clerk might wear on her day off, was torn at the shoulder and stained dark across the bodice. Not all of it was dirt. She tried to open her eyes. One obeyed. The other had swollen shut, the skin around it tight and hot. Through the haze, she could make out the trail stretching endlessly in both directions, twin ruts worn into the earth by wagon wheels and hope. No wagons now. No hope either, as far as she could tell. Her fingers twitched. That was something. She focused on that small victory, tried to make them do it again. They curled slightly, scraping at pebbles that bit into her palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, and almost welcome because it meant she was still here, still breathing, still clinging to whatever came after this moment. How long, she thought. How long since they'd thrown her from the carriage? Since Mitchell's face, always so composed behind his desk at Rocky Mountain Trust, had twisted into something unrecognizable as he'd struck her the first time? You should have stayed quiet, he'd said. Should have kept your pretty little nose in the ledgers where it belonged. She'd seen the numbers. That was her crime. 3 months of discrepancies that shouldn't have existed, accounts that balanced on paper but dissolved into nothing when you looked beneath the surface. And Victor Crane, poor trusting Victor, had believed her when she'd shown him. Had believed her right up until someone put 2 bullets in his chest and left him in his office with the vault door hanging open. They'd made it look like robbery. Made it look like Elena had done it. A sound reached her through the ringing in her ears. Hoofbeats. Distant but growing closer. She tried to lift her head and immediately regretted it. The world tilted sideways and bile rose in her throat. She managed to turn her face just enough to keep from choking on it, then went still again, waiting for the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision to recede. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped. Boot heels on packed earth, measured, deliberate. Not the frantic scramble of someone rushing to help, but not quite the casual stride of someone passing by either. She heard them circle her once, staying just far enough back that she couldn't see who they belonged to. Assessing, deciding. Still breathing? The voice was male, low, with an edge that suggested its owner didn't waste words on observations that weren't useful. Barely. Another set of footsteps approached. Lighter, quicker. Mr. Blackthorne, she's in bad shape. We need to get her back to the house. Obviously. A pause. Check for weapons first. Hands patted her down with professional efficiency, avoiding the places where she was clearly broken. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Everything she'd carried, the documents, the proof, the only leverage she'd had, was gone. Mitchell had made sure of that before he'd ordered her dumped like trash beside a trail that saw maybe 3 travelers a week. Au sol. Clean, the second voice reported. Younger, worried. No papers, no money, nothing but... He hesitated. She's quality, sir. Look at the dress, even torn up like this. The fabric, the stitching. This isn't some ranch hand's daughter. I can see that, Thomas. The one called Blackthorne moved closer. Elena felt him crouch beside her, felt the displacement of air as he leaned in. Can you hear me? She managed something between a groan and a whisper. Close enough. I'm going to turn you over. It's going to hurt. It did. Everything screamed in protest as careful hands shifted her weight, rolled her onto her back. The sky came into view, blue and infinite and entirely indifferent to the fact that she was dying under it. Then a face blocked out the sun. Sebastian Blackthorne looked exactly like the kind of man who could own half a territory and still want more. Sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't so carefully controlled, dark hair going silver at the temples, eyes the color of winter slate. He studied her the way she'd once studied ledgers, methodically, looking for the story the numbers told. His gaze moved over her face, her injuries, the blood soaking through her dress. He didn't flinch, Didn't react at all except for the slightest tightening around his mouth. Beaten, he said, more to himself than to Thomas. Professionally, someone who knew what they were doing. He looked at her eyes, the one that could still focus anyway. This wasn't random. Elena tried to speak, her lips cracked, bleeding fresh. Please, don't. His hand came up, not touching but close enough that she could feel the heat of it. Don't waste your strength. We're 10 miles from my estate. You'll need everything you have left to survive the trip. Her voice broke. She swallowed, tasted copper. They'll come back. Something flickered across his face then. Not quite interest, but close. Who will? But the darkness was closing in faster now, pulling her down into it despite her best efforts to stay present, to stay conscious, to make him understand that helping her was a mistake that could cost him everything. Her working eye rolled back. No. Blackthorn's voice cut through the encroaching black. Sharp, commanding, the kind of tone that probably moved railroad tycoons and politicians. Stay with me. What's your name? Elena. Elena what? But she was gone, sliding away from the heat and the pain and the slate-gray eyes that saw too much. The last thing she registered was being lifted, surprisingly gentle for hands that looked like they'd built an empire. And then nothing. Ushike. The guest room at Blackthorn Estate existed in a different world than the one Elena had left behind on that trail. High ceilings. Wallpaper in shades of cream and gold. Windows that stretched nearly floor to ceiling, framed by heavy velvet curtains currently drawn against the afternoon light. The bed she woke in felt like a cloud wrapped in Egyptian cotton, and for one disoriented moment, she thought she might have died after all, and somehow ended up somewhere she didn't deserve. Then she tried to move, and her body reminded her exactly where she was and what had happened to her. A sound escaped her. Half gasp, half whimper, and immediately there were footsteps. A woman appeared in her line of sight, middle-aged, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the no-nonsense expression of someone who'd seen plenty of trouble and wasn't impressed by more of it. Easy now. The woman's hands were firm but careful as she helped Elena settle back against the pillows. You've got 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that nearly killed you, and enough bruising to make a prizefighter wince. Moving's going to be unpleasant for a while yet. Elena's throat felt like sand. Where? Blackthorn Estate, 20 miles south of Iron City. I'm Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper. She held a glass of water to Elena's lips, supporting her head with practiced ease. Drink slowly. Your stomach's been through enough without you rushing it. The water was cool and clean and the best thing Elena had ever tasted. She managed 3 small sips before her stomach clenched in warning. Good enough for now. Mrs. Hawthorne set the glass aside. Dr. Yates has been by twice. Says you're lucky you've got a hard head, though personally I think luck had less to do with it than sheer stubbornness. She pulled a chair closer to the bed, settling into it with the air of someone who planned to stay a while. You've been unconscious for nearly 18 hours. Mr. Blackthorn will want to know you're awake. Elena's pulse spiked. I need to leave. You need to heal. Leaving would involve standing, which you can't do. Walking, which is right out. And getting past me, which I can promise you won't happen. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. Whatever you're running from, child, it'll still be there when you're strong enough to face it. Might as well recover properly first. You don't understand. I understand that Mr. Blackthorn brought you here half dead and told me to see to it you stayed alive. That's all I need to understand. She stood, smoothing her apron. I'll let him know you're conscious. Whether you talk to him is your business, but he's not a patient man and he likes answers to questions. Fair warning. She left before Elena could protest further. The door closed with a soft click, and Elena was alone with her thoughts and the very elegant prison she'd woken up in. She took inventory, starting with what worked and moving through what didn't. Her left eye had opened sometime during her unconscious hours, though the swelling made seeing through it difficult. Both arms functioned, though the right shoulder screamed when she tried to lift it above chest height. Her ribs, she didn't need to touch them to know they were bad. Each breath was a reminder. Legs seemed mostly intact, but Mrs. Hawthorne was right about standing. When she tried to shift her weight even slightly, the room did a slow spin that sent nausea rolling through her. Think, she ordered herself. Mitchell believes you're dead. That's an advantage. Use it. But to do what? The evidence was gone. Victor was dead. Anyone who might have believed her was either bought off or too smart to risk their neck for a clerk who'd been conveniently framed for murder and theft. And she was lying in the home of a man she didn't know, who'd saved her for reasons she couldn't begin to guess, in a body that could barely manage consciousness, let alone escape. The door opened again. Elena's breath caught. Sebastian Blackthorne entered like he owned the room, which she supposed he did. He'd changed since the trail, trading dust-covered riding clothes for a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she'd earned in 6 months. But his eyes were the same, cold, assessing, missing nothing. He stopped a respectful distance from the bed, hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Elena, you're awake." "Mr. Blackthorne?" Her voice came out rough. "Thank you for helping me." "Don't thank me yet. You don't know what it'll cost you." He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look out over grounds she couldn't see. "I don't make a habit of collecting broken strangers from the roadside. Bad for business, generally. People talk." "Then why did you?" He glanced back at her. "Curiosity, mostly. You said something before you passed out, about people coming back." He turned fully now, leaning against the window frame. "I've lived in this territory for 15 years, built a railroad spur, a lumber mill, and enough political capital to influence territorial elections. In all that time, I've developed an instinct for when someone's in the kind of trouble that doesn't stay contained. So I'll ask you plainly, what kind of trouble did I just invite onto my property?" Elena met his gaze as steadily as she could manage, with one eye still half swollen. He wanted honesty? Fine. She had nothing left to lose. "The kind that gets people killed," she said quietly. "The kind that involves very rich, very connected men who don't like loose ends. And I'm a loose end." Blackthorne's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Interested now. Really interested. "Go on?" "I worked as a clerk at Rocky Mountain Trust in Iron City. 3 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in several high-value accounts. Money moving in ways that didn't make sense. Documentation that looked legitimate, but fell apart when you traced the transactions back to their source." She had to pause to breathe, and even that hurt. "I brought it to the attention of Victor Crane. He was the senior accountant, a good man." "Was?" 2 weeks ago, someone shot him twice in his office. Made it look like robbery. Made it look like I was the one who did it." Her hands fisted in the bed sheets. "I didn't. But the evidence says otherwise, and the people who arranged it have enough money and influence to make sure no one looks too closely at that evidence." Names. She hesitated. Giving him names was dangerous, for both of them. But what choice did she have? He'd already saved her life. If Mitchell and his associates found out she was here, Blackthorne would be in their crosshairs whether she warned him or not. Harrison Mitchell. He's the chief operating officer at Rocky Mountain Trust. On the surface, he's respectable, civic-minded, donates to the church, serves on the town council. Underneath, he's running a scheme that's siphoning money from depositors' accounts and funneling it through shell investments. Blackthorne's eyes narrowed. "Mitchell, I know that name. He tried to broker a deal with my railroad interests last year. I declined." "Smart man, perhaps." He pushed away from the window, moving closer. "What else?" "There are others. I don't know all the names, but I saw correspondence. Letters with signatures I couldn't quite make out, references to the syndicate. This isn't just one man's embezzlement scheme. It's organized, coordinated." She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "And I had proof. Documents, ledger copies, letters. I'd been collecting evidence for weeks, planning to take it to the federal marshal in Denver." "Had?" "They took it when they—" Her voice caught. She forced it steady. "When they beat me and left me for dead." Silence settled over the room. Blackthorne stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. Elena couldn't tell if he believed her or was already calculating how quickly he could hand her over to the authorities and wash his hands of the mess she'd brought to his door. Finally, he spoke. "If what you're saying is true, you're not just a loose end. You're a liability they can't afford to leave breathing." "I know." "They'll come looking, not immediately. They'll assume you died on that trail, and it'll take time for them to realize you didn't. But when they do figure it out, they'll be thorough." "I know that too." She met his gaze. "Which is why I need to leave as soon as I can stand. I won't bring this to your door. Too late for that. The moment Thomas and I picked you up, we brought it here ourselves. He crossed his arms. Besides, where exactly do you think you'd go? You can't walk, can't ride, and you look like you lost a fight with a freight train. You'd make it maybe 5 miles before you collapsed, and then they really would find you. Better me than you. He laughed, short and sharp, entirely without humor. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment, Miss Elena. I've survived claim jumpers, railroad wars, and more than one attempt to buy me out at gunpoint. I'm still here because I don't run from fights, especially not ones that walk onto my property half dead and bleeding. This is different. These men, are criminals. Wealthy ones, I'll grant you, but criminals nonetheless. And I've dealt with their type before. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. You'll stay here until you're strong enough to leave safely. That's not negotiable. In the meantime, I suggest you rest and let Mrs. Hawthorne earn her considerable salary keeping you alive. He glanced back. And Miss Elena, if you're lying to me about any of this, you'll find I'm significantly less charitable than the men who left you on that trail. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. Elena slumped back against the pillows, exhausted by the conversation and the effort of staying conscious through it. Sebastian Blackthorne was either the answer to a prayer she hadn't dared voice, or he was another kind of danger entirely. Wealthy men didn't help penniless clerks out of kindness. They did it because they saw an angle, an opportunity, something they could leverage to their advantage. She just had to figure out what he wanted before he figured out how to use her. Gimten. 3 days passed in a haze of laudanum-laced water and Mrs. Hawthorne's gentle tyranny. Elena wasn't allowed out of bed except to use the necessary, and even that involved the humiliating assistance of the housekeeper and a sturdy cane. Her ribs hurt less than they had initially, but breathing deeply was still an adventure in creative cursing. Dr. Yates came by on the 4th day, a compact man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the brisk manner of someone who'd seen too much suffering to waste time on bedside pleasantries. "Healing well," he announced after examining her bruises and checking her vision. "Better than you have any right to, given the beating you took. The ribs will ache for another month at least. Keep the binding tight, avoid any strenuous activity, and for the love of common sense, don't try riding a horse anytime soon." "I'll do my best," Elena said dryly. He gave her a look that suggested he'd heard that particular lie before. "Mr. Blackthorne tells me you'll be staying on as his guest for the foreseeable future. That true?" "Apparently." "Good. The man can be difficult, but his household is clean and well run, and Mrs. Hawthorne knows how to manage recovery. You're in capable hands." He snapped his bag shut. "I'll check on you again next week. Try not to do anything stupid in the meantime." After he left, Elena made her first real attempt at getting out of bed unassisted. It took 20 minutes and more swearing than she was proud of, but eventually she managed to stand on shaking legs, using the bedpost for support. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet, and the room tilted alarmingly, but she stayed upright. Small victories. The window drew her like a promise. She made her way to it slowly, one shuffling step at a time, and pulled back the heavy curtain. The view stole what little breath she had. Blackthorne Estate sprawled across the landscape like something out of a fever dream. Hundreds of acres of carefully managed land, outbuildings that looked more like small manors than barns, fencing that went on forever. And in the distance, the main house's west wing catching the afternoon light. Wealth, power, the kind of untouchable security that men like Mitchell could only aspire to despite all their scheming. And she was standing in the middle of it, broken and wanted for murder, with absolutely no plan beyond surviving the next hour. The door opened without warning. Elena didn't have time to make it back to the bed before Blackthorne entered, stopping short when he saw her on her feet. "Dr. Yates said no strenuous activity." "Standing isn't strenuous. It is when you look like you're about to faint." He crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her elbow before her knees could betray her completely. "Stubborn doesn't suit you as well as you think it does." "And arrogance suits you perfectly, I suppose?" His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I've earned my arrogance. You're just borrowing yours from desperation." He guided her back to the bed with surprising gentleness. "Sit before you fall." She sat, mostly because the alternative was proving his point the hard way. He remained standing, watching her with that same assessing look he'd worn on the trail. You're healing faster than expected, he said finally. That's good. We need to talk about what happens next. Elena's stomach tightened. You're sending me away. No, though I'll admit the thought crossed my mind. He pulled the chair Mrs. Hawthorne had abandoned closer to the bed and sat, regarding her with unsettling focus. I had my men make some inquiries, discreet ones. About you, about Rocky Mountain Trust, about Harrison Mitchell. Her heart hammered against her ribs. And you were telling the truth. Victor Crane is dead, shot in his office, vault open, money missing. You're wanted for his murder. There's a $500 reward for information leading to your arrest. He paused. Mitchell issued the warrant himself. Very concerned about bringing his colleague's killer to justice, apparently. Quite the performance, from what I'm told. The room felt suddenly smaller. So you know I'm worth money. Are you planning to collect? If I wanted the reward, you'd already be on your way to Iron City in chains. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. What I want is to understand why a bank clerk would risk everything, her career, her freedom, her life, to expose a fraud scheme that didn't directly affect her. Elena looked away, focusing on the window and the impossible landscape beyond it. Because it was wrong. Plenty of things are wrong. Most people learn to live with that. I couldn't. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. I watched Mitchell and his associates steal from people who trusted the bank with their savings, families, working men, people who'd never see that money again, who'd never even know it was gone until they needed it and found their accounts empty. And they'd blame themselves, think they'd miscounted, misremembered, made some mistake. She turned back to face him. I couldn't live with that, with knowing and doing nothing. Blackthorne studied her in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. You're either remarkably principled or remarkably foolish. Can I be both? Usually are. He stood, moving toward the door again, apparently his preferred exit strategy. There's something else you should know. The reward notice includes a description. Dark hair, medium height, late 20s, scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. Very specific. Elena's blood went cold. She looked down at her left hand, at the thin white line running across her palm from when she'd fallen through a neighbor's greenhouse window at age 7. Mitchell knows me, she whispered. Of course he knows me. I worked for him for 3 years. Which means he knows you survived long enough to potentially talk to someone. Anyone. The fact that you haven't turned up dead in a ditch somewhere will make him nervous. Blackthorne's expression was grim. Nervous men with money and influence are dangerous. They make mistakes, but those mistakes tend to involve more bodies, not fewer. Then I really do need to leave. And go where? With what resources? You don't even have shoes that fit. He shook his head. No. You're staying here, where I can control the situation, where I can watch the roads and know who's coming before they arrive. Running would just make you an easier target. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why do you care? You don't know me. This isn't your fight. He paused in the doorway, his back to her. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I told you before. I'm curious, and I don't like being lied to or stolen from. Mitchell tried to involve me in one of his schemes last year. I declined, but the presumption annoyed me. He glanced back at her. This is an opportunity to make him regret that presumption. Consider yourself a very expensive investment in settling old business. Before she could respond, he was gone. Elena sat in the empty room, her mind racing. Sebastian Blackthorne was using her. That much was obvious. But for what exactly? Revenge? Leverage? Some business advantage she couldn't see yet? Whatever his motives, they aligned with her survival for now, and that was more than she'd had 4 days ago when she'd been bleeding out on a frontier trail. She'd take it, she'd use it. And when the time came, if she survived long enough, she'd figure out what price he'd ultimately demand for his protection. Outside, the sun was setting over the vast estate, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow, beautiful and ruthless, like the man who owned it. Elena closed her eyes and tried to rest, knowing that whatever came next would require all the strength she could gather. The dangerous game was only beginning. By the end of the first week, Elena had graduated from prisoner in a bed to prisoner with walking privileges. Mrs. Hawthorne had produced a wardrobe from somewhere, simple dresses in dark colors that fit well enough, though they hung a bit loose on her frame. The mirror in the guest room showed Elena a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with bruises fading from purple to sickly yellow across her cheekbone. She looked like exactly what she was, someone who'd barely survived something they shouldn't have. The estate itself was a revelation. What she'd glimpsed from the window turned out to be just the beginning. Blackthorn's property stretched for what felt like miles in every direction, a kingdom unto itself with its own rhythms and hierarchies. Ranch hands worked the cattle operations to the west. Timber crews managed the forest to the north. And everywhere, the quiet hum of money, real money, the kind that built empires and crushed competitors without breaking stride. She'd been permitted to take meals in her room initially, but on the 8th day, Mrs. Hawthorne had different ideas. "You're well enough to come downstairs," the housekeeper announced, laying out a dove-gray dress that looked more dinner-appropriate than anything Elena had worn in months. "Mr. Blackthorne expects you in the dining room at 7. "Expects?" "It's not a request, dear." Mrs. Hawthorne's tone was gentle, but firm. "He wants to discuss your situation, and he prefers to do it over a meal, like civilized people. I suggest you don't keep him waiting. He gets irritable when his schedule's disrupted." Elena wanted to argue, but the truth was she'd been going quietly mad in this room, beautiful as it was. The walls felt closer every day, and the silence left too much space for thinking about Victor's body slumped over his desk, about Mitchell's cold eyes as he'd given the order to dispose of her, about how close she'd come to disappearing without a trace. She dressed carefully, her ribs protesting every movement. The face in the mirror still looked haunted, but at least it looked human again. She pinned her hair back, dark and unruly, refusing to cooperate, and made her way downstairs for the first time since she'd arrived. The main house was even more impressive from the inside. High ceilings with exposed beams, furniture that managed to look both expensive and comfortable, artwork on the walls that suggested someone with actual taste had chosen it. This wasn't the garish display of new money trying too hard. This was wealth that had settled into itself, confident and permanent. A young man in house livery, Thomas, she realized, the one who'd been with Blackthorne on the trail, appeared to guide her to the dining room. He smiled politely but didn't quite meet her eyes. Nervous, she thought. Probably had instructions not to get too friendly with the wanted murderer his employer was harboring. The dining room could have seated 20 easily. Tonight it held 2 place settings, one at the head of the table and one to its right. Blackthorne was already there, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey, watching the sun finish its descent behind the western hills. He turned when she entered. His gaze swept over her, clinical, assessing, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he'd just catalogued exactly how much she'd improved and calculated how much further she had to go. "Miss Elena, punctual. I appreciate that." He gestured to the chair. "Please sit. Dinner will be served shortly." She sat, acutely aware of how out of place she felt in this room, with its crystal chandelier and silver that probably cost more than her annual salary had been. Blackthorne took his seat at the head of the table, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain the formality of it. "You're moving better," he observed. "Dr. Yates says you're healing ahead of schedule." "Clean living and good nutrition," Elena said lightly, then immediately regretted the attempt at humor when his expression didn't change. "Or stubbornness? That seems more likely." He took a sip of his whiskey. "How are you sleeping?" The question caught her off guard. Well enough, I suppose." "You suppose?" "I wake up sometimes. Bad dreams." She looked down at her hands, folded carefully in her lap. "It passes. I imagine it does." He set the glass aside as a servant appeared with the first course, some kind of soup that smelled divine. Trauma tends to make itself known in inconvenient ways. The mind processes what the body survives. Elena picked up her spoon, if only to have something to do with her hands. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Everyone who's lived long enough has experience with trauma, Miss Elena. The question is whether you let it define you or just inform you." He started eating with the kind of precise manners that suggested formal training. "I've had men try to kill me 3 times, twice over railroad contracts, once over a woman who wasn't worth the bullet they wasted. Each time taught me something useful about human nature and business practices." "What did they teach you?" "That loyalty is purchased, not earned. that contracts are only as good as the fear backing them up, and that women who play men against each other for profit are remarkably predictable in their patterns. He glanced up at her. What's your trauma teaching you? She thought about it while she ate. The soup was perfect, rich and warming, settling into her stomach like comfort she hadn't known she needed. That trust is expensive, that telling the truth doesn't guarantee safety, and that sometimes doing the right thing just makes you a target, accurate if depressing. Blackthorn leaned back as his bowl was cleared away. But incomplete. You're also learning that survival isn't pretty, that help comes from unexpected places, and that you're capable of enduring more than you thought possible. Those lessons are worth remembering. The main course arrived, venison with roasted vegetables, prepared with a skill that made Elena wonder what kind of cook Blackthorn employed. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the quiet broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china. Finally, Blackthorn spoke again. I've been thinking about your situation. Elena's appetite vanished. And I believe you're approaching it wrong. You're thinking like a victim, hiding, healing, hoping the problem resolves itself, or that you'll somehow slip away unnoticed once you're strong enough to travel. He cut into his venison with surgical precision. That's not a strategy. That's just slow suicide. What would you suggest instead? Offense. He met her gaze directly. You said you had evidence. Documents, ledgers, correspondence. They took it when they dumped you, but evidence doesn't exist in only one place. There are source materials, original records, people who know things they haven't said yet. All of which are in Iron City, under Mitchell's control. Some of which are in Iron City, Blackthorn corrected. But banking fraud on the scale you're describing requires infrastructure beyond one city. Transfer records, telegraph confirmations, accounts in other institutions that received the stolen funds. Mitchell may control Rocky Mountain Trust, but he doesn't control the entire financial system. Elena set down her fork, her mind starting to work through the implications. You're suggesting we build a new case, find new evidence. I'm suggesting we find evidence that already exists and force it into the open before Mitchell can destroy it. He took another sip of whiskey. I have contacts, people who owe me favors or want to earn them. A federal banking inspector in Denver who's been looking for a reason to investigate Rocky Mountain Trust for years. A journalist in Chicago who specializes in financial corruption and loves nothing more than exposing wealthy criminals. That would take time, resources, money. I have all three. He said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. What I don't have is the insider knowledge you possess. You worked there for 3 years. You know how they operate, where they keep their records, who handles what transactions. That information is valuable. Elena felt her pulse quicken. You want to use me as bait. I want to use you as a weapon. Blackthorn's smile was thin and sharp. There's a difference. Bait just sits there waiting to be taken. A weapon strikes first. And what do you get out of this? You said I was an investment in settling old business, but this is more than petty revenge over a declined business deal. He was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its calculated edge. Mitchell and men like him represent everything I despise about wealth. They didn't build anything, didn't create value or take real risks. They just found ways to skim from people too trusting or too powerless to fight back. It's parasitic, cowardly. He set his glass down with a soft click. I came to this territory with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work until my hands bled. Everything I have, I built. And I'll be damned if I'll let men like Harrison Mitchell pretend they're my equals just because they're clever thieves. Elena studied him across the table. There was anger there, yes, but something else too. Pride, certainly. But also, surprisingly, principle. However ruthless Sebastian Blackthorn might be in business, he had lines he wouldn't cross, and Mitchell had apparently crossed them. If we do this, she said slowly, if we go after them, it won't just be dangerous. It'll be a fight they'll throw everything at stopping. Money, influence, violence. They've already killed Victor and tried to kill me. They won't hesitate to expand that list. I'm aware. Blackthorn leaned forward slightly. Which is why we don't give them time to organize a response. We move quickly, precisely, and we make sure when we strike, it's fatal to their operation. Half measures just make them more dangerous. You're talking about destroying them completely. I'm talking about justice, Miss Elena, which in this case happens to look a lot like destruction. He held her gaze. The question is whether you have the stomach for it. Testifying is one thing. Actively participating in taking down powerful men who want you dead is another. It requires a certain kind of ruthlessness. Elena thought about Victor, kind, careful Victor, who'd believed her when no one else would. About the families whose savings had been stolen. About Mitchell's face as he'd struck her, the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. I have the stomach for it, she said quietly. What's your plan? Blackthorn smiled then, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. First, we need to establish what evidence still exists and where. I'll reach out to my contact at the federal banking office. You'll write down everything you remember about the fraud scheme. Accounts, dates, amounts, methods. Every detail, no matter how small. That could take days. Then we have days. You're not going anywhere, and neither is Mitchell's operation. It's been running for months, probably years. Another week won't matter to them, but it'll give us the foundation we need. The meal continued with Blackthorn outlining his network of contacts and resources with the kind of casual competence that came from years of building an empire. Elena listened, asked questions, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time since Victor's death, since her world had collapsed into blood and accusations, she felt something other than fear. She felt angry, focused, dangerous. After dinner, Blackthorn walked her back toward the stairs, a courtesy she hadn't expected. They paused at the base of the grand staircase, and he turned to face her. One more thing, he said. While you're here, you're under my protection. That means you follow my rules. You don't leave the grounds without my permission or escort. You don't contact anyone from your previous life. And you don't make decisions that affect your safety without consulting me first. Elena bristled slightly. I'm not a prisoner. No, you're an asset, and I protect my assets. His tone softened marginally. I understand you're accustomed to independence, but your independence nearly got you killed. Let me do what I'm good at, which is controlling situations and neutralizing threats. In return, you do what you're good at, remembering details and refusing to stay quiet when you see injustice. It was a bargain, plainly stated, and despite her instinctive resistance to being managed, Elena had to admit it made sense. She was alive because he'd intervened. Staying that way probably required trusting his judgment, at least for now. All right, she said. Your rules. For now. For now is all I'm asking. He stepped back, creating distance between them again. Get some rest, Miss Elena. Tomorrow we start working in earnest, and I'll need you sharp. She climbed the stairs carefully, her ribs reminding her with each step that she was still healing. When she reached the landing and looked back, Blackthorn was already gone, disappeared into some other part of his vast house to do whatever wealthy railroad magnates did with their evenings. In her room, Elena found paper, ink, and a pen laid out on the writing desk by the window. Mrs. Hawthorne's work, probably, anticipating the need before it was voiced. She settled into the chair and began to write. The first page was the hardest. Forcing herself to remember the details, to reconstruct the pattern she'd seen in the ledgers, felt like picking at a wound that hadn't quite healed. But once she started, the numbers came back with crystalline clarity. Account numbers. Transfer dates. The names of shell companies that existed only on paper. The discrepancies that had first caught her attention, small at first, then growing bolder as whoever was running the scheme gained confidence. She wrote for hours, filling page after page with cramped handwriting, stopping only when her hand cramped too badly to continue. By the time she finally set the pen down, she had a stack of papers that represented everything she could remember about the fraud scheme. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was a map, and maps led to destinations. She slept better that night than she had since the attack. The nightmares still came, Mitchell's face, the pain of breaking ribs, the helpless terror of being thrown from the carriage. But they felt less immediate somehow, less like prophecy, and more like history. The next morning brought a new routine. After breakfast, Elena was escorted to Blackthorn's private study, a room that smelled of leather and tobacco, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk covered in papers and maps. He was already there when she arrived, reading through the pages she'd written the night before. Thorough, he said without looking up. I'm impressed. This level of detail is exactly what we need. I have a good memory for numbers. So I'm learning. He set the papers aside and pulled out a fresh sheet. Now I need you to map the personnel. Who worked which accounts? Who had access to what records? Who reported to whom? If we're going to identify weak points in their operation, we need to understand the human infrastructure. They worked through the morning, with Elena describing the staff at Rocky Mountain Trust, while Blackthorn took notes and asked questions that got at things she hadn't considered. By noon, they had a chart that showed the entire organizational structure, with annotations about who might be complicit, who was likely just incompetent, and who might be persuadable if approached correctly. There, Elena said, pointing to a name near the bottom. Samuel Pritchard. He's a junior clerk, handles a lot of the day-to-day documentation. He was friends with Victor. They'd have lunch together sometimes. You think he knows something? I think he saw things. Whether he understood what he was seeing is another question. But he's honest, careful. If anyone outside of Victor and me noticed something wrong, it would be Samuel. Blackthorn made a note. Is he the type who could be intimidated into silence? Elena considered. Maybe. He's not brave, exactly. But he's decent. If you gave him a way to do the right thing that didn't put his family at risk, he has a wife and 2 small children, he might take it. Useful. Blackthorn sat back, studying the chart. What about Mitchell's personal assistant? Vanessa something? Vanessa Hartley. She's been with him for 5 years. Elena frowned. She's smart, ambitious, and completely loyal to Mitchell. If there's anyone who knows where all the bodies are buried, it's her. Can she be bought? Everyone can be bought if the price is right. The question is whether we can afford her price and whether we can trust her not to take our money and then betray us to Mitchell anyway. Elena shook her head. She's too dangerous. If we approach her and she doesn't bite, we've shown our hand. Agreed. He made a mark through her name. Then we focus on the ones who might actually help. Pritchard, for one. There's also... He paused as someone knocked on the study door. Enter. Thomas stepped in, looking apologetic. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's a rider from town, says he has a telegraph message for you, marked urgent. Blackthorn's expression didn't change, but Elena saw his shoulders tense slightly. Bring it here. Thomas handed over a sealed envelope and retreated. Blackthorn opened it, read the contents, and went very still. What is it? Elena asked, though she already knew it couldn't be good. He handed her the message without comment. She read it twice, her stomach sinking further with each pass. Federal Marshal. Stop inquiring. Rocky Mountain Trust. Stop. Warrant issued Elena Mercer. Stop reward. Increased 1,000. Stop Mitchell. Pushing hard. Stop situation. Escalating. Stop. Advise caution. Stop. They're accelerating, Elena whispered. Why? If they think I'm dead, they're not sure anymore. Blackthorn took the message back, his expression grim. Someone talked. Or someone saw something. Either way, Mitchell's nervous enough to push for federal involvement, which means he's trying to legitimize the hunt. Make it official, so when they do find you, there's no question about jurisdiction or legality. He's trying to control the narrative. Exactly. And succeeding from the looks of it. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to look out over his domain. This changes our timeline. We can't take days to prepare anymore. We need to move now, before they expand the search to include properties like mine. Elena's heart hammered. You think they'll look here? Eventually. I'm known to have opinions about men like Mitchell, and I'm wealthy enough to be a threat. It's only a matter of time before someone suggests checking whether I'm harboring you, either out of genuine suspicion or just to harass me. He turned back to face her. We have maybe a week, 2 at the outside. That's not enough time to build a case. No. But it's enough time to get you to Denver and put you in front of my contact at the federal banking office. If we can convince him to open an official investigation before Mitchell consolidates his position, we might be able to turn this around. Elena stood, ignoring the protest from her ribs. Denver's 3 days by coach, 4 if the weather's bad, and Mitchell will have people watching the roads. The moment I show my face, you won't be showing your face. You'll be traveling as my widowed sister, recently arrived from Philadelphia and too grief-stricken to be social. We'll take my private coach with outriders for security, and we'll move fast enough that anyone watching won't have time to organize an interception. That's insane. The risk is considerable but manageable. Blackthorn moved back to the desk, already shifting into planning mode. I'll send Thomas ahead tonight with instructions to my contacts in Denver. We'll leave tomorrow at dawn. That gives us tonight to prepare your story and make sure you can maintain the fiction if anyone asks questions. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But looking at his face, set and determined, she realized he'd already made the decision, and short of running away on her own, she was going to Denver whether she liked it or not. What if they stop the coach? She asked quietly. What if they search it? Then we'll deal with it. I don't make a habit of being unprepared for confrontation. His smile was cold. And I found that most men, even desperate ones, think twice before starting a fight with someone who can afford to finish it properly. Mitchell's already killed for this. He won't hesitate to kill again. Neither will I. The words hung in the air between them. Elena realized with a cold shock that he meant it. Sebastian Blackthorn might be wealthy, educated, refined in all the ways that mattered to high society. But underneath the tailored suits and careful manners, he was someone who'd survived in a territory that didn't forgive weakness. Someone who'd built an empire in a place where empires got torn down by force as often as they failed through incompetence. He was dangerous, and right now, that was exactly what she needed. All right, she said. Denver, tomorrow. I'll be ready. Good. He rang a small bell on his desk, and Mrs. Hawthorne appeared with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been waiting just outside. Mrs. Hawthorne, Miss Elena will need traveling clothes, something appropriate for a respectable widow, dark colors, nothing flashy, and pack her a small trunk. We'll be gone at least a week. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose fractionally, but she just nodded. Of course, sir. Anything else? Dinner at 6, and tell the kitchen to pack provisions for a journey. We leave at first light. After Mrs. Hawthorne left, Elena stood uncertainly in the middle of the study. I'll go prepare. Write down anything else I remember that might be useful. Do that. Blackthorn was already pulling out maps, marking routes. And Miss Elena, get some rest tonight. The next few days are going to test exactly how much you've healed. She left him there, surrounded by papers and plans, orchestrating their next move with the kind of focused intensity she imagined he brought to all his business dealings. As she climbed the stairs back to her room, Elena felt the weight of what they were about to do settle over her. Going to Denver meant leaving safety, meant putting herself back in the world where she was wanted for murder, where $1,000 would make even honest men consider turning her in. It meant trusting that Sebastian Blackthorn's wealth and connections would be enough to protect them both. It meant choosing to fight instead of hide. In her room, she stood before the mirror again. The woman looking back was still pale, still healing, but there was something different in her eyes now, something harder. Elena Mercer, the bank clerk, would have been terrified, would have found a way to refuse, to put off the danger for another day. But that woman had died on the Ash Hollow Trail. The woman who'd survived her was still figuring out who she was, still learning what she was capable of, still discovering that sometimes the only way out was straight through the fire. She sat at the writing desk and began composing her widowed sister's story, complete with a dead husband named James and a tragic shipping accident off the coast of Delaware. The lies came easier than they should have, which probably said something about how much she'd changed. Outside, the sun was setting again over Blackthorn Estate. Tomorrow it would rise on a journey that would either save her or destroy them both. Elena wrote until her hand cramped, until the details of her false life felt as real as her actual one, until she could recite her tragic backstory without hesitation. When she finally slept, the nightmares had changed. Now instead of running, she was standing her ground. Instead of being hunted, she was hunting back. It felt like progress. Dawn came too early and too cold. Elena woke to find Mrs. Hawthorne already in her room, laying out traveling clothes with the efficient silence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Black dress, heavy enough for travel, but not so ornate it would draw attention. A mourning veil tucked carefully into the trunk. Gloves. A shawl that looked expensive but understated. Mr. Blackthorn's already downstairs with the coach, Mrs. Hawthorne said quietly. Eat something before you go. It's a long journey, and you'll need your strength. Elena forced down bread and coffee, her stomach too tight with nerves to manage much else. The face in the mirror looked appropriately pale and grief-stricken. No acting required there. She tucked her hair up, pinned the veil in place, and became someone else. Margaret Blackthorne, widow, sister, tragic figure too broken by loss to engage with strangers. The coach waiting in the drive was everything she'd expected from a man like Sebastian Blackthorne. Polished black lacquer, brass fittings that gleamed in the early light, springs and suspension that promised a smoother ride than most. 4 horses stamped and snorted in the cold, their breath misting. 2 outriders sat their mounts nearby, both armed with rifles and the kind of weathered competence that suggested they knew how to use them. Blackthorne stood beside the coach, dressed for travel in dark wool and leather, a long coat that did nothing to hide the revolver at his hip. He looked up as Elena approached, his gaze sweeping over her transformation with approval. "Convincing," he said. "Remember, you're in mourning. You don't speak unless absolutely necessary. If anyone addresses you, you defer to me. The grief is too fresh, the pain too raw. Understood?" "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, and she cleared her throat. "I understand." "Good." He handed her up into the coach with the kind of casual courtesy that probably came from years of practice. The interior was as luxurious as the exterior promised. Velvet seats, small oil lamps for reading, even a lap blanket folded neatly in the corner. "We'll make Iron City by evening if we push hard. We'll stay the night at the Grand Hotel. I keep a suite there. Then on to Denver the next day." Elena's stomach dropped. "Iron City? We're going through Iron City?" "We have to. It's the only route to Denver that doesn't add 3 days to the journey." He settled into the seat across from her as Thomas closed the door. "And it's the last place Mitchell will expect to find you. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight." Before she could argue, the coach lurched into motion. The outriders fell in alongside, and Blackthorne Estate began to recede behind them. Elena watched through the small window until the buildings disappeared entirely, swallowed by distance and the rolling hills. "You're thinking this is a mistake," Blackthorne said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking Mitchell has eyes everywhere in Iron City. The hotel, the telegraph office, the train depot. If word gets out that you're traveling with a woman, then they'll assume she's exactly who we're claiming she is. My widowed sister from Philadelphia, come west for a change of scenery, and my sparkling company." He pulled out a newspaper, shaking it open with practiced ease. "The best lies are the ones people want to believe. No one's looking for Elena Mercer traveling openly with Sebastian Blackthorne. They're looking for a desperate fugitive hiding in shadows." He had a point, much as Elena hated to admit it. Still, the closer they got to Iron City, the harder her heart hammered. These were the streets she'd walked for 3 years, the buildings she'd passed every morning on her way to work, the places where people knew her face, knew her name, knew— "Stop," Blackthorne said without looking up from his paper. "What?" "Stop spiraling. I can practically hear you thinking yourself into a panic from here." He turned a page. "Fear makes people careless, makes them second-guess decisions that were sound when they made them. We committed to this path. Now we see it through." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one wanted for murder." "No. I'm just the one harboring a fugitive, which carries its own set of unpleasant consequences if things go wrong." He finally looked at her over the edge of the newspaper. "We're in this together now, Miss Elena. Your problems became mine the moment I picked you up off that trail. So either trust that I know what I'm doing, or spend the next 2 days making yourself sick with worry. Your choice." Elena took a slow breath, forcing her hands to unclench from the lap blanket she'd been strangling. He was right. The decision was made. Panicking now wouldn't change anything except make her useless when they needed to be sharp. "Fine," she said. "Together. Better." He returned to his newspaper, apparently content to read while the miles rolled past beneath them. The journey settled into a rhythm. The coach swayed and rocked over roads that varied from decent to barely there. They stopped twice to water the horses and stretch legs that had gone numb from sitting. During the second stop, one of the outriders, a man named Carson with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, approached Blackthorne with a quiet word. "Riders behind us, sir. Been keeping pace for the last hour." Elena's breath caught. Blackthorne's expression didn't change at all. "How many? 3? Maybe 4. Staying back far enough it's hard to count. Armed? Can't tell from this distance, but I'd assume yes." Blackthorne was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, Let them follow. Don't engage unless they make a move. I want to know who they are and what they want before we show our hand." Carson nodded and moved back to his horse. Elena grabbed Blackthorn's arm before she could stop herself. "What if it's Mitchell's men? What if they know?" "Then we'll handle it." He gently removed her hand from his sleeve. But jumping to conclusions helps no one. Could be bandits. Could be travelers headed the same direction. Could be men I paid to follow us and make sure no one else tries anything. She stared at him. "You hired people to follow us?" "I hired people to watch our backs, yes. Did you think I'd take you through hostile territory with just 2 outriders and hope for the best?" He helped her back into the coach. "I don't take unnecessary risks, Miss Elena. Everything I do is calculated." They continued on, and Elena found herself watching through the back window for signs of the riders Carson had mentioned. She caught glimpses occasionally, distant figures that could have been anything or anyone. The uncertainty gnawed at her worse than knowledge would have. By late afternoon, the landscape began to change. More settlements, more traffic on the road. And then, cresting a hill, Iron City spread out before them in the valley below. It looked smaller than Elena remembered, more contained. The buildings she'd thought so impressive when she'd first arrived 3 years ago now seemed modest compared to the scope of Blackthorn's estate. The Rocky Mountain Trust building stood near the center of town, its brick facade catching the slanting sunlight. She'd walked through those doors every morning at 8. Had sat at her desk in the corner by the window, adding columns of figures and reconciling accounts. Had believed naively that numbers couldn't lie and that institutions existed to protect people, not prey on them. "Pull the veil down," Blackthorn said quietly. "And remember, you're too grief-stricken to notice much of anything. Eyes down, shoulders slumped, broken." Elena adjusted the black lace, and the world became a dark blur. She let her posture collapse, becoming smaller in her seat, becoming Margaret, whose husband had drowned, whose life had shattered, who was too lost in sorrow to care about the world passing by outside. The coach rolled into town. Elena could hear the change. More voices, the clatter of wagons, the general noise of a place where people lived and worked and went about their lives with no idea that a wanted murderer was passing through their streets. They turned a corner. Another. The rhythm of the wheels changed as they moved from packed dirt to cobblestones. Then they stopped. "Grand Hotel," Blackthorn announced. "Stay in character. Let me do the talking." The door opened. Blackthorn stepped down first, then turned to help Elena. She took his hand, careful to move like someone half-broken by grief, and descended into the fading daylight of Iron City's main street. The Grand Hotel was exactly as she remembered. 3 stories of false-front optimism, trying to be fancier than it was, and almost succeeding. The desk clerk was new, someone Elena didn't recognize, which was a small mercy. Blackthorn approached him with the kind of confident authority that made lesser men straighten up and pay attention. "Mr. Blackthorn," the clerk said, his face brightening. "Welcome back, sir. We have your usual suite prepared." "Excellent. And an adjoining room for my sister. She's recently widowed and requires quiet and privacy." The clerk's gaze flicked to Elena with appropriate sympathy. "Of course, sir. My condolences, ma'am. We'll make sure you're not disturbed." Elena nodded mutely, keeping her eyes downcast. Behind the veil, her heart was trying to climb out of her chest. Every second standing here in the open felt like tempting fate. She recognized the wallpaper in the lobby, had walked past it dozens of times when she'd met colleagues here for lunch. If anyone from the bank came through those doors right now, "The luggage," Blackthorn was saying. "Have it brought up immediately, and send dinner to the rooms at 7. Something simple. My sister's appetite hasn't returned yet." "Right away, sir." They were escorted upstairs by a young porter who kept his eyes carefully away from Elena's veiled face. The suite was on the 3rd floor overlooking the main street. Blackthorn had clearly stayed here before. The porter knew exactly which rooms to open, which lamps to light, where to place the luggage when it arrived. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Blackthorn?" "Privacy, and make sure the staff knows my sister is not to be disturbed for any reason." "Of course, sir." The porter accepted the coin Blackthorn pressed into his palm and disappeared. The moment the door closed, Elena pulled off the veil and gasped for air like she'd been underwater. "We're here. We're actually here in Iron City, where Mitchell is probably sitting in his office 3 blocks away, completely unaware that we're in town." Blackthorn moved to the window, looking out over the street. Breathe, Miss Elena. We're here one night. Tomorrow morning we're gone before most of the town wakes up. What if someone recognizes me? What if you stop inventing disasters and focus on what we can control? He turned from the window. You stay in these rooms. You don't go out for any reason. If someone knocks, you don't answer. I'll handle anything that needs handling. And where will you be? Making arrangements for tomorrow's departure. Sending telegrams. Meeting with an old associate who owes me information. He checked his pocket watch. I'll be back by 9 at the latest. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. Elena wanted to argue, to insist on going with him, to do anything but sit alone in a hotel room 3 blocks from the men who wanted her dead. But one look at Blackthorn's face told her the argument was already over. Fine, she said. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, he confirmed. Then, surprisingly, his expression softened slightly. I know this is difficult, but you've survived worse than sitting in a comfortable room for a few hours. You can survive this too. After he left, Elena locked the door and sat in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of Iron City filtering up from the street. Voices, laughter, the distant piano from a saloon. Normal life, continuing as it always had, while she sat here invisible and terrified. She tried to eat when dinner arrived, knocked and left outside the door per Blackthorn's instructions, but managed only a few bites before her stomach rebelled. Instead, she paced the room like a caged animal, counting steps, counting minutes, counting all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. At 8:15, someone knocked on the door. Elena froze mid-step. Who is it? Telegram for Mr. Blackthorn, ma'am. The clerk said to bring it up right away. Leave it outside the door? I need a signature, ma'am. Hotel policy. Her mouth went dry. It could be legitimate, could be exactly what the voice claimed. Or it could be a trick to get her to open the door, to confirm she was here, to... Ma'am, I really need that signature. Just leave it. I'll bring it down to the desk later. Silence. Then, are you sure? Because Mr. Mitchell was very specific that Mr. Blackthorn needed to receive this immediately. Elena's blood turned to ice. Mitchell. The voice had said Mitchell. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. If they knew she was here, if they'd connected her to Blackthorn, if they were testing whether she'd answer, Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying the lock. Elena looked around frantically. The room had 2 doors, the main one to the hallway, and a connecting door to the adjoining suite Blackthorn had rented. She moved to the connecting door as quietly as she could, trying the handle, locked from the other side. The rattling stopped. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. She stood frozen, listening to her own heartbeat, trying to decide if she'd just narrowly avoided disaster or was being paranoid. The knock could have been legitimate. The mention of Mitchell could have been innocent. Maybe he'd sent a business telegram to Blackthorn, nothing sinister. Or maybe they knew exactly where she was and were testing her response. She stayed away from both doors, positioned herself where she could see both and neither could see her, and waited for Blackthorn to return. Every creak of the building settling made her jump. Every voice in the hallway sent her pulse racing. At 10 minutes to 9, a key turned in the lock. Elena grabbed the fireplace poker, the only weapon available, and raised it defensively. The door opened. Blackthorn stepped through, saw her with the poker, and raised an eyebrow. Planning to redecorate? She lowered the makeshift weapon, her hand shaking. Someone came, said they had a telegram, said Mitchell sent it. His expression went cold and focused. What did you do? Told them to leave it outside. They tried the door handle. Then they left. She set the poker down before she dropped it. Was it real? The telegram? I don't know. Let me check. He stepped back into the hallway, was gone for less than a minute, and returned empty-handed. Nothing there. Either they took it with them, or it was never real to begin with. So they know. Maybe. Or someone's fishing, trying to confirm suspicions. He closed and locked the door, then moved to check the window, making sure no one was positioned across the street with a clear line of sight. Either way, we're not staying. Pack what you need for travel. We leave tonight. But you said... I said morning. I'm revising that assessment. He pulled out his pocket watch. I've got a coach arranged for 11. Different vehicle, different driver, no Blackthorn insignia. We'll look like ordinary travelers, and we'll take the north road out of town instead of the main route to Denver. Elena's hands were steadier as she gathered the few things she'd unpacked. The fear was still there, but it had crystallized into something sharper, more useful. They'd almost been caught, almost been exposed, but almost wasn't the same as actual, and they still had a chance to slip away. "Where did you go?" she asked as she repacked the trunk. "What arrangements?" "Telegraphed to my contact in Denver, letting him know to expect us sooner than planned. Conversation with the sheriff, old friend, owes me favors, agreed to look the other way if certain questions arise about visitors to the Grand Hotel." He checked his revolver, making sure it was loaded. "And a visit to someone who knows things about Mitchell's operation." "Who?" "Samuel Pritchard." Elena's hands stilled on the clothes she was folding. "You contacted Samuel? Here? Tonight?" "I had Thomas do it quietly. Pritchard agreed to meet me at a neutral location. He was nervous, but he came." Blackthorn's smile was grim. "Turns out your assessment was correct. He's decent, and he's noticed things, strange account transfers, documents that don't quite add up. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he knew something was wrong." "Did he agree to help?" "He's terrified, but yes. He's been keeping copies of anything that looked suspicious, just in case," he said. "Didn't know what he'd do with them, but felt wrong to let them disappear." Blackthorn pulled a folded envelope from his coat. "He gave me these, enough to raise serious questions about Rocky Mountain Trust's accounting practices." Elena took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were document copies, transfer orders, account ledgers, correspondence between Mitchell and unnamed associates. Not everything she'd lost, but enough. Enough to show the pattern, enough to prove she hadn't invented the fraud scheme. "He's risking everything giving you these." "I know. I told him to destroy any evidence that he'd made copies. Told him to act as normal as possible until he hears otherwise. If this works, he'll be protected. If it doesn't," Blackthorn shrugged, "then we'll all have bigger problems than Samuel Pritchard's employment prospects." A clock somewhere in the hotel struck 10. Blackthorn moved to the window again, watching the street. "The coach will meet us at the north end of town. We'll leave through the service entrance, cut through the alley behind the hardware store, and approach from the residential side where there's less traffic." "You've done this before. Smuggled people out of places." "I've done a lot of things before." He let the curtain fall. Most of them legal, some of them less so, all of them necessary at the time. Tonight falls somewhere in the middle. At 10:30, they gathered their things and prepared to leave. Elena donned the veil again, becoming Margaret Blackthorn once more. Blackthorn carried the small trunk himself rather than risk involving hotel staff. They descended via the back stairs, servant access, rarely used at this hour, and emerged into the alley behind the Grand Hotel. The night was cold and moonless. Good for hiding, terrible for seeing threats before they materialized. Blackthorn kept Elena close, one hand on her elbow, guiding her through darkness that would have been completely disorienting on her own. They moved quickly, but not frantically, just two travelers navigating an unfamiliar town. The hardware store loomed ahead, its back entrance secured with a chain and padlock. Blackthorn led her around it, through a gap between buildings barely wide enough for two people walking single file. Elena's dress caught on something, a nail maybe, or a splinter of wood, and tore with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. They froze, listened, heard nothing but distant voices from the saloon 3 streets over and the barking of a dog somewhere to the east. "Keep moving," Blackthorn murmured. They emerged onto a residential street Elena recognized. She'd walked past these houses before, had admired their neat gardens and painted shutters while heading to work each morning. Now they looked dark and slightly threatening, windows like watching eyes. A coach waited at this end of the street, exactly where Blackthorn had said it would be. Plain, unmarked, with a driver who nodded once and said nothing as they approached. Blackthorn helped Elena inside, loaded the trunk, and climbed in after her. The coach rolled forward immediately. No delay, no conversation. They were moving, escaping, getting away with something that should have been impossible. Elena didn't breathe properly until Iron City disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness and distance. Even then, she kept expecting to hear pursuit, hoofbeats thundering after them, voices shouting for them to stop, the crack of gunfire. But there was only the rattle of wheels on packed earth and the soft creak of leather as Blackthorn settled into his seat across from her. "Well done," he said quietly. "That was the hard part." The hard part was sneaking out of a hotel, The hard part was going back to the place where they nearly killed you and not falling apart. He pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to her. Denver will be easier. Federal territory, federal law, and people who can't be bought as easily as Mitchell's local connections. Elena accepted the flask, took a careful sip. Whiskey, smooth and warming. She handed it back and leaned against the coach wall, suddenly exhausted. What if Samuel gets caught? What if they figure out he gave us those documents? Then he'll deny it. Say someone must have broken into his desk, that he had no idea the copies existed. Blackthorne returned the flask to his pocket. But I don't think they will. Mitchell's attention is going to be entirely focused on finding you, not on auditing his junior clerks. Arrogance makes men careless. And if your federal contact doesn't believe us, if he looks at these papers and decides they're not enough, then we find someone else. Push harder. Make more noise until someone pays attention. He met her gaze across the dark interior of the coach. I told you before, we're committed to this path. That means we don't stop until Mitchell and his associates are exposed or we're dead. Preferably the former, but I'm prepared for either outcome. Elena wanted to ask if he really meant that, if he'd actually risk his life and fortune for a principal and a stranger he'd known for barely 2 weeks. But looking at his face in the dim light filtering through the coach window, she thought she already knew the answer. Sebastian Blackthorne didn't bluff, didn't make empty threats or promises he couldn't keep. He'd survived building an empire in hostile territory by being smarter, more ruthless, and more stubborn than anyone else. And he decided that bringing down Harrison Mitchell was worth the considerable risk involved. She just hoped they both survived long enough to see it through. The coach rattled on through the darkness, carrying them toward Denver and whatever waited there, justice, vindication, or the final confrontation that would end one way or another. Elena closed her eyes and tried to rest, knowing sleep wouldn't come but needing the pretense of it anyway. Outside, the night stretched endlessly in all directions, full of dangers she couldn't see and couldn't avoid. But she wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding. She was hunting back. And that, somehow, made all the difference. Denver appeared through the morning haze like a promise that might be kept or broken, depending on who you asked. 3 days of hard travel had left Elena bone-tired and jumpy, seeing threats in every passing rider and suspicious intent in every roadside stop. But they'd made it. The coach rattled through streets that were wider and busier than iron cities, past buildings that actually deserved the grandeur they claimed, and Elena felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since they'd fled the hotel. Blackthorne had barely slept during the journey, keeping watch even when it was unnecessary, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. Now, as they passed the federal courthouse, an imposing brick structure that dominated an entire city block, he finally allowed himself to settle back in his seat. "We'll go to my contact first," he said. "William Grayson, federal banking inspector, incorruptible to a fault, and mean as a snake when he smells fraud." He glanced at Elena. "He's not going to be easy to convince. He'll want more than your word and a handful of documents Samuel managed to save." "What does he need?" "A pattern, multiple sources, evidence that can't be explained away as clerical errors or misunderstandings." Blackthorne pulled out the envelope Samuel had given them, studying its contents again in the morning light. "What we have is a start, but it's not enough to take down men with Mitchell's resources." The coach stopped outside a modest boarding house on the edge of the business district. Blackthorne helped Elena down, and they were met by a thin man in his 50s with iron gray hair and the kind of suspicious eyes that probably made criminals confess just to avoid prolonged examination. "Blackthorne." William Grayson's voice was clipped and professional. "Your telegram was cryptic even by your standards. What's this about Rocky Mountain Trust?" "Inside," Blackthorne said. "This conversation needs privacy." Grayson's gaze shifted to Elena, taking in the widow's clothes and the exhaustion she couldn't quite hide. "And this is?" "Elena Mercer, the woman Harrison Mitchell framed for murder to cover his fraud scheme." Grayson's expression didn't change, but something sharpened in his eyes. "The wanted clerk. There's a $1,000 reward for her." "I know, you're welcome to try collecting it after we're done talking." Blackthorne's tone suggested that would be unwise. "But I think you'll find what she has to say more valuable than money." They followed Grayson inside, up creaking stairs to a second-floor office that smelled of old paper and strong coffee. The room was cramped, dominated by a desk buried under files and ledgers, with barely enough space for 3 people to sit without knocking knees. Grayson settled behind his desk like a judge, preparing to pass sentence. Talk. And it better be worth the risk I'm taking by not arresting her on sight. Elena took a breath and began. She told him everything, the discrepancies she'd noticed, the pattern that had emerged when she'd started digging deeper, Victor Crane's murder, and the frame job that had followed. She talked for nearly an hour, interrupted occasionally by Grayson's sharp questions, watched constantly by eyes that missed nothing and believed less. When she finished, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush. Documents, Grayson said finally. You mentioned documents. Blackthorne handed over the envelope. Grayson spread the contents across his desk, studying each page with the kind of focused intensity that probably made him excellent at his job and terrible at dinner parties. Minutes passed. Elena's palms were sweating despite the cool morning air. Finally, Grayson sat back. This is good. Better than good. This is actionable. These transfer orders alone suggest systematic fraud. The correspondence implies conspiracy. He looked at Elena. But it's not complete. You said you had more. Comprehensive evidence that tied everything together. I did. They took it when they tried to kill me. Then we need to get it back. Grayson pulled out a clean sheet of paper, dipped his pen. Tell me everything you remember about what they took. Every document, every page, every number. Elena closed her eyes and went back to that awful day. The documents had been in a leather satchel, brown, worn, with a broken clasp she'd been meaning to fix. Inside, she'd carefully organized everything by category. Bank ledgers showing the original transactions, copies of transfer orders she'd made from the vault records late one night when everyone else had gone home. Correspondence she'd found in Mitchell's office when he'd sent her to retrieve a file. Letters discussing the syndicate, referencing accounts by number rather than name, outlining percentages and distribution schedules. She recited it all from memory, and Grayson wrote it down in neat, efficient script. When she finished, he had 3 full pages of notes. All right, he said. Here's the problem. What you've described would be enough to launch a federal investigation and likely secure indictments. But it's gone. And without it, all I have is your testimony, which a good lawyer will shred by pointing out you're wanted for murder, and these documents from Samuel Pritchard, who Mitchell will claim is either lying or mistaken. So what do we do? Elena asked. Grayson tapped his pen against the desk, thinking. We need more sources, independent verification that corroborates your account, bank employees who've noticed irregularities, customers who've discovered their accounts don't match their records, other institutions that receive suspicious transfers from Rocky Mountain Trust. That could take weeks, Blackthorne said. We don't have weeks. The moment Mitchell realizes Elena's alive and talking to federal authorities, he'll destroy everything that isn't already destroyed and disappear. Then we need leverage. Grayson stood, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a thick folder, flipped through it. I've had my eye on Rocky Mountain Trust for 2 years. Nothing concrete enough to move on, but plenty of smoke suggesting fire. Small complaints, accounting discrepancies that resolved themselves too conveniently. Customers who swore they'd deposited more than the bank's records showed. Why didn't you investigate? Politics. Mitchell's connected. Town council, territorial legislature, probably has friends in Washington I don't know about. Going after him without ironclad evidence would have gotten me reassigned to counting pennies in some backwater post. He pulled out several pages, laid them alongside Elena's documents. But if we can connect these old complaints to the current fraud scheme, if we can show a pattern of behavior spanning years, that's harder to dismiss as coincidence or clerical error. Elena leaned forward, studying the pages. Names she recognized. Complaints filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. One from a widow who'd sworn her husband had left her $2,000, only to find the account held barely $800. Another from a rancher who'd deposited proceeds from a cattle sale and somehow lost half of it between the bank counter and the ledger. These people, she said quietly, can we talk to them? Get them to testify? If they're still alive and willing to revisit painful memories that probably cost them everything. Grayson's expression was grim. People who complain about powerful institutions tend to have unfortunate accidents, or they get pressured into silence, or they just give up because fighting is expensive and exhausting. We have to try. Elena met his gaze. They deserve to know it wasn't their fault. that they weren't crazy or careless, that they were robbed, and the man who robbed them is going to answer for it. Grayson studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, we'll start making inquiries. Quietly. I'll reach out through official channels, banking oversight, see what shakes loose. In the meantime, you two need to stay out of sight. Mitchell has reach, and if he figures out you're here talking to me, things will get complicated fast. I have a property on the edge of town, Blackthorne said. Small house, discreet. We'll use that. They spent another hour planning who Grayson would contact, what evidence he'd request from other institutions, how they'd coordinate if something broke. By the time they left, Elena felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Victor had died. They had an ally. They had a plan. They had a chance. The house Blackthorne had mentioned turned out to be more than small. It was barely larger than a shed, tucked behind a feed store with peeling paint and windows that rattled in their frames. But it was private, and after 3 days in a coach, Elena would have been grateful for a barn. Inside was Spartan, but clean. One main room with a stove and table, a tiny bedroom barely big enough for the narrow bed, and an outhouse round back that made her miss the luxuries of Blackthorne Estate with painful intensity. It's not much, Blackthorne said, setting their bags down. I bought it years ago as an investment that never materialized, but it's secure, and no one will think to look for us here. It's perfect. Elena moved to the window, looking out at the alley behind the feed store. How long do you think before Grayson finds something useful? Days. Maybe a week if people are reluctant to talk. He was checking the locks on the door, testing the window latches. The question is whether we have that long before Mitchell makes a move. As if summoned by the mention of his name, trouble arrived that evening in the form of a messenger boy who knocked timidly on the door just after sunset. Blackthorne opened it to find a scrawny kid of maybe 12 holding an envelope. Message for Mr. Blackthorne, sir. Man paid me $1 to deliver it personal. Blackthorne took the envelope, handed the kid $2. What did the man look like? Fancy suit. Walked like he owned the street. Had cold eyes, sir. Real cold. After the boy left, Blackthorne opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery with 3 lines written in elegant script. Mr. Blackthorne, we should talk. Come alone. The Silver Palace, 9 o'clock, HM. Elena read over his shoulder, her stomach sinking. Mitchell, he knows we're here. Apparently. Blackthorne held the note up to the lamplight, as if examining it might reveal hidden threats. The question is how much he knows. Does he know you're with me? Or is this just a fishing expedition? Either way, you can't go. It's obviously a trap. Probably, but it's also an opportunity. He folded the note carefully. Mitchell wouldn't reach out like this unless he was worried. Worried means weak. Weak means mistakes. Or it means he's planning to kill you and eliminate the one person with enough money and influence to actually threaten him. Elena grabbed his arm. This is exactly what he wants, to separate us. Get you alone where his men can… Elena. Blackthorne's use of her first name without the miss stopped her mid-sentence. I've been handling dangerous men since before you were born. Mitchell doesn't scare me, and whatever he's planning, I'll be ready for it. Can't know that. No, but I know that avoiding this meeting sends a message that I'm afraid, and showing fear to men like Mitchell is the fastest way to get yourself killed. He checked his revolver again, then tucked a small derringer into his boot. I'll go. I'll listen to whatever he has to say, and I'll come back. Trust me. I barely know you. True, but I'm the best option you've got right now, so that'll have to be enough. He pulled on his coat. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. If I'm not back by midnight, find Grayson and tell him everything. Before Elena could argue further, he was gone, disappearing into the Denver evening like he did this sort of thing every day. Maybe he did. Maybe this was just another business negotiation, except the stakes were lives instead of money. She locked the door and waited, watching the clock on the mantel tick away the minutes with agonizing slowness. 8:30, 8:45. 9 o'clock came and went. She imagined Blackthorne walking into the Silver Palace, wherever that was, confronting Mitchell across a table. What would they say to each other? What threats would be exchanged? What deals might be offered? And would Blackthorne come back, or would she be alone again, waiting for footsteps that would never come? At 10:15, she heard voices in the alley, male voices, at least 3 of them, talking in low tones that didn't carry words but conveyed intent well enough. Elena moved away from the window, grabbing the fireplace poker again, her weapon of choice lately, and positioned herself where she could see the door. The voices stopped right outside. Someone tried the door handle, found it locked. There was a pause, then a sharp kick that rattled the frame but didn't break it. "We know you're in there." The voice was unfamiliar, rough with the kind of casual menace that suggested violence was just a job, nothing personal. "Make this easy on yourself. Open the door." Elena didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't make a sound. Another kick. This one cracked the frame. One more would probably do it. Then different footsteps, running, and a new voice. "Federal Marshal, step away from that door." The roughness in the first voice shifted to surprise. "This doesn't concern you, friend." "I'm not your friend, and everything in this city concerns me when it involves breaking and entering. I said, step away." Silence. Elena could imagine the standoff happening outside, armed men weighing their options, deciding if whatever they'd been paid was worth a fight with federal law. Apparently it wasn't. She heard footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. A knock, gentle this time. "Miss Mercer? It's Deputy Marshal Davis. Mr. Grayson sent me to keep watch. You can open the door. They're gone." Elena cracked it open, keeping the chain latched, and saw a young man in a federal marshal's uniform with his hand resting on his holstered revolver. He looked sincere enough, but she'd learned not to trust appearances. "How do I know Grayson sent you?"
Ensuite, chance.
"He said to tell you the widow from the complaint filed in 71 had a cat named Bernard. Said you'd mentioned it when you were going through the files in his office." She had mentioned that. Odd detail to remember, but she'd commented on how sad it was that the woman's complaint had listed her cat as her only remaining family. Elena unlatched the chain. "Thank you. Those men were probably hired to scare you or worse." Davis positioned himself outside the door, eyes scanning the alley. "I'll be here until Mr. Blackthorne returns. Grayson figured Mitchell might try something tonight, and he was right." Elena left him there and went back inside, her hands still shaking from the near miss. Mitchell was moving faster than they'd anticipated, escalating, which meant he was either confident he could eliminate the threat or desperate enough to take risks. Neither option was comforting. Blackthorne returned just before 11, looking unharmed but grimmer than she'd seen him since the trail. Davis nodded to him and melted back into the darkness, keeping watch from somewhere less visible. "What happened?" Elena demanded the moment he was inside. "Mitchell's scared." Blackthorne removed his coat, poured himself a drink from the bottle he'd brought with their supplies. "Very scared, which makes him very dangerous." "What did he say?" "He offered me money. Quite a lot of it, actually. Said if I convinced you to leave Denver, to disappear and never surface again, he'd make it worth my while financially and politically." Blackthorne took a long drink. "When I declined, he threatened to destroy my railroad interests. Claimed he had enough influence with the territorial legislature to block my expansion plans indefinitely. And I told him I've survived bigger threats from better men." He set the glass down. "Then things got interesting. He changed tactics. Started talking about how this whole situation was just a misunderstanding, how Victor Crane's death was tragic but unrelated to any alleged fraud, how you were clearly unstable, probably suffering from some kind of mental breakdown, and the kindest thing would be to get you proper medical attention rather than encouraging your delusions." Elena felt cold fury rising. "He called me crazy." "He called you a lot of things. None of them flattering." Blackthorne met her gaze. "But here's what was interesting. He never once asked where you were, never mentioned you being in Denver, just talked in general terms about you disappearing. So he doesn't know I'm here?" "Oh, he knows, but he's pretending he doesn't, which means he's trying to separate what he knows from what he can prove. It's a legal strategy. If this goes to court, he wants to be able to claim he had no idea you were in the city, that he was just having a business conversation with me about unrelated matters." Elena sank into the single chair by the stove. "What else?" "He knows we met with Grayson. Didn't say it directly, but he made a comment about federal inspectors who overstep their authority and end up reassigned to positions where they can't cause trouble. That was a threat aimed at Grayson through me." "Can he actually do that? Get Grayson reassigned?" "Maybe. Depends on how much pull he actually has versus how much he's bluffing." Blackthorn poured a second drink, this one for Elena. She accepted it gratefully. But it confirms that Mitchell has sources feeding him information. Either someone in the federal building or someone watching Grayson's office, or both. So we can't trust anyone. We trust Grayson because we have to, and we trust ourselves. Everyone else is suspect until proven otherwise. He settled into the other chair. They were close enough in the small room that their knees almost touched. There's one more thing. Mitchell suggested a trade. What kind of trade? He returns all the evidence you collected, every document, every ledger page, everything. In exchange, you sign a confession to Victor Crane's murder and leave the territory permanently. Elena stared at him. That's insane. Why would I confess to something I didn't do? Because it gets him what he wants. You discredited and gone, unable to testify against him with the murder officially solved and filed away. You'd be admitting guilt but agreeing to exile rather than trial. He framed it as mercy. Mercy. The word tasted bitter. He beats me nearly to death, frames me for murder, tries to have me killed, and now he's offering mercy. It's all performance. He's building a narrative where he's the reasonable one, and we're the obstacles to a peaceful resolution. Blackthorn finished his drink. Of course I told him where he could put his offer, but I wanted you to know it was made. He's looking for ways out that don't involve prison. There isn't one. No, but he doesn't know that yet. Blackthorn stood, moving to the window to check the alley. Grayson's man scared off Mitchell's hired muscle tonight, but they'll try again. We need to move faster, push harder, force Mitchell into making a mistake he can't recover from. How? By going after the evidence directly. The documents he took from you, they're not destroyed. He'd keep them as insurance, proof of what you had in case he needs leverage later. Blackthorn turned from the window. We find where he's keeping them and take them back. Elena laughed, a sharp sound with no humor in it. Break into wherever Mitchell's hiding evidence? That's not a plan. That's suicide. It's aggressive, I'll grant you. But Mitchell's focused on defense right now, watching his back, protecting his position, trying to shut down threats before they materialize. He's not expecting us to come at him directly. Because it's insane. Because it's dangerous. There's a difference. Blackthorn crossed his arms. Think about it, Elena. We can wait for Grayson to build a case through official channels, slow, methodical, probably effective if we have enough time. Or we can take what we need and hand Grayson everything at once, overwhelming evidence that can't be explained away or buried through political influence. And how exactly do we break into Mitchell's office, or his home, or wherever he's keeping locked documents? Same way you gathered the original evidence, carefully, during hours when he's not there, using knowledge about the building and its security that you possess, and I can supplement with money and planning. He sat back down across from her. You worked at Rocky Mountain Trust for 3 years. You know the building, the schedules, the weak points. Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to say this was exactly the kind of reckless plan that got people killed. But sitting here waiting for Grayson to work through bureaucracy while Mitchell tightened his grip and eliminated threats, that felt like slow death instead of quick. The vault, she said slowly. If Mitchell kept the documents, they'd be in the vault. It's the most secure location in the building. Combination lock, iron door, guard on duty overnight. Can the guard be bribed? Thomas Welch. He's been there 15 years, honest. Wouldn't take money from Mitchell, probably won't take it from us either. Then we work around him. When does he make his rounds? Elena closed her eyes, remembering. Every hour, checks all 3 floors, tests the doors and windows. Takes about 20 minutes. That's our window. We go in during his rounds, get to the vault, open it, find the documents, and get out before he returns to the first floor. Blackthorn was already planning. She could see it in his eyes. Do you know the combination? No, Mitchell changed it after Victor died. Part of securing the crime scene. Then we'll need a safecracker. I know a man in Denver who owes me a favor. Not cheap, but reliable. This is insane, Elena said again, but with less conviction this time. This is necessary. Blackthorn leaned forward. Mitchell's not going to wait for us to outmaneuver him through legal channels. He's going to keep pushing, keep threatening, keep escalating until someone ends up dead. Probably you. Possibly me. Maybe even Grayson, if he's too much of an obstacle. And if we get caught breaking into the bank, we'll both hang. Then we don't get caught. He said it with the kind of confidence that came from succeeding at impossible things before. I've built a railroad through territory that was actively trying to kill me. I've outmaneuvered competitors with more money and better connections. I've survived 3 assassination attempts and a territorial governor who wanted me arrested on fabricated charges. I'm very good at not getting caught." Elena looked at him across the small space between them. This wealthy, dangerous man who'd picked her up off a trail for curiosity's sake and somehow ended up committed to destroying her enemies. She barely knew him, didn't fully trust him, had no reason to believe this would work. But he was right about one thing. Waiting was just another way of dying. "All right," she said, "we break into Rocky Mountain Trust, we get the evidence, and we pray this works better than it sounds." Blackthorn smiled, sharp and predatory. "I don't pray, Miss Elena. I plan, and then I execute. Tomorrow, we start reconnaissance. By this time next week, we'll have everything we need to bury Harrison Mitchell so deep he'll never see daylight again." Outside, Denver continued its evening business, unaware that 2 people in a small house behind a feed store were planning something that would either save them or destroy them completely. Elena supposed they'd find out which soon enough. The reconnaissance took 3 days that felt like 3 weeks. Blackthorn had Elena sketch the interior of Rocky Mountain Trust from memory. Every office, every hallway, every window and door that might serve as entry or exit. She drew until her hand cramped, trying to remember details she'd never paid attention to when the building had just been her workplace rather than a fortress they needed to breach. The safecracker arrived on the 2nd day. His name was Porter, a slight man in his 40s with delicate hands and the kind of forgettable face that was probably an asset in his profession. He studied Elena's drawings with the focused attention of a surgeon examining anatomy charts. "This vault," he said, tapping the sketch. "Iron door, you said. What manufacturer?" "I don't know. There's a plate on it, but I never looked that closely." "Mosler, Diebold, Hall's patent?" Elena closed her eyes, trying to picture it. The plate had been brass, she remembered that much. Engraved lettering. "Hall's, I think. Hall's Safe and Lock Company." Porter nodded, satisfied. "Good. I've opened a dozen of those. Combination lock, 4 numbers, standard mechanism. Quiet work, but not impossible. I'll need 40 minutes, maybe 50 if the lock's been maintained properly." "Thomas does his rounds every hour," Elena reminded him. "You'll have 20 minutes at most. Then I work fast." Porter's smile was thin. "For what Mr. Blackthorn's paying, I'll work however fast you need." On the 3rd evening, they gathered in the small house to finalize the plan. Grayson was there too, looking deeply uncomfortable with the whole enterprise, but unable to offer a better alternative. "This is illegal," he said for the 3rd time. "Breaking and entering, safe cracking, theft. Even if you're taking back stolen property, the law won't see it that way." "The law hasn't been particularly effective at protecting Elena so far," Blackthorn said. "We're doing what's necessary." "And if you get caught? If Mitchell's men are watching the building? If the guard doesn't follow his normal schedule?" Grayson shook his head. "There are too many variables. Too many ways this goes wrong. Which is why we're being thorough." Blackthorn spread out the final version of their plan. Timing, entry points, signals if something went wrong. "Elena gets us inside through the service entrance. She knows which key opens which door because she used to help close up when she worked late. We go to the vault, Porter opens it, we retrieve the documents, and we leave. Total time inside the building, 90 minutes. And I wait here," Grayson said, "with a federal warrant ready to execute the moment you return with evidence, assuming you return at all." "Optimism, William. Try it sometime." But Blackthorn's tone was tight with tension he was trying not to show. They went over it twice more, until everyone knew their role and the timing was burned into memory. Then Porter left to gather his tools, and Grayson departed with a final warning about federal prosecutors who didn't look kindly on vigilante justice. Alone in the small house, Elena and Blackthorn sat in silence as the evening deepened into night. Tomorrow. They'd go tomorrow, during Thomas Welch's midnight rounds when the streets would be emptiest and the darkness deepest. "Are you afraid?" Blackthorn asked finally. Elena considered lying, then decided against it. "Terrified, you?" "Concerned, which is different but related." He was cleaning his revolver again, the 3rd time that evening, nervous energy looking for an outlet. "I've taken calculated risks before. This one just has higher stakes than usual. Your fortune, your reputation, your freedom." Elena watched him work. "Why are you doing this? Really?" I know what you said about Mitchell and men like him, but this is beyond principle. This is personal. Blackthorn set the revolver aside, meeting her gaze directly. When I came to this territory, I had nothing. Not money, not connections, not even a particularly marketable skill set, just ambition and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I built everything you've seen through persistence and calculated aggression. But I also built it by understanding that wealth without purpose is just accumulated numbers, meaningless. And this gives you purpose? This reminds me why I wanted wealth in the first place. Not for luxury, though I won't pretend I don't enjoy it, but for the freedom to make choices that matter, to stand between powerful predators and vulnerable people and say no, not this time. He leaned forward. Mitchell represents everything I could have become if I'd chosen differently. Someone who sees people as resources to exploit rather than lives with inherent worth. Taking him down isn't just about justice for you or Victor Crane. It's about proving to myself that I didn't build an empire just to become another variety of monster. Elena hadn't expected that level of honesty, hadn't expected him to voice doubts or examine his own motivations with such clarity. She'd thought Sebastian Blackthorn was simply a wealthy man who enjoyed winning, but apparently there were layers beneath the calculated exterior. What happens after? She asked quietly. Assuming we survive this, assuming we get the evidence and Mitchell goes to prison, what happens to us? You'll be exonerated, publicly cleared of all charges. The territorial governor will probably issue a formal apology, and you'll receive compensation for what you've lost. He said it matter-of-factly, like these things were simple certainties rather than complicated legal processes. As for us, that depends on what you want. What I want? You'll have your life back, your freedom, the ability to go anywhere, do anything. You won't need my protection or my resources anymore. His expression was carefully neutral. So the question becomes whether you'll choose to leave or stay. Elena realized with some surprise that she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her entire focus had been on survival, on clearing her name, on making sure Mitchell paid for what he'd done. The future beyond that had seemed too distant and uncertain to contemplate. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't let myself think past tomorrow night. Fair enough? Blackthorn stood, moving to the window to check the street one more time. Get some rest if you can. We leave at 11. Sleep was impossible, of course. Elena lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of Denver settling into its nighttime rhythms, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. The guard could break his pattern. Mitchell could have men watching the building. The vault could be empty, the documents already destroyed. They could be walking into an ambush that would end with both of them dead in a bank they were robbing. But doing nothing meant waiting for Mitchell to eliminate them at his convenience. At least this way they were choosing the terms of engagement. At 11:15, Elena dressed in dark, practical clothes Mrs. Hawthorne had somehow procured and sent ahead. Blackthorn was already ready, checking his revolver one final time. Porter arrived exactly on schedule, carrying a leather case that presumably held his tools. Last chance to reconsider, Blackthorn said, but his tone suggested he knew she wouldn't. Let's go get our evidence back. They moved through Denver's streets like ghosts, keeping to alleys and shadows, avoiding the few people still out at this hour. Porter was silent as death, his footsteps making no sound. Blackthorn moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this sort of thing before, and Elena followed, her heart hammering so loud she was certain everyone in the city could hear it. Rocky Mountain Trust loomed ahead, dark except for a single light on the first floor where Thomas Welch would be making his rounds. They circled to the service entrance, a door Elena had used 100 times, never imagining she'd be breaking through it in the middle of the night. She pulled out the key she'd kept, the one Mitchell hadn't known to confiscate because it had been in her pocket rather than her desk when they'd come for her. Her hand shook as she fitted it into the lock. It turned. The door opened. They were inside. The interior was exactly as Elena remembered, and completely alien in the darkness. Familiar desk shapes became threatening obstacles. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like thunder. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm announcing their presence. Blackthorn consulted his pocket watch. Thomas started his rounds 4 minutes ago. We have 16 minutes to get to the vault. They moved quickly through the main floor, past desks where Elena had worked alongside people who probably still believed she was a murderer. Past Mitchell's office with its expensive furniture and carefully curated image of respectability, to the back stairs leading down to the basement level where the vault waited. The door was exactly as she remembered, massive iron with the brass plate she'd correctly identified as Hall's Safe and Lock Company. Porter approached it like a lover, running his hands over the surface, testing the combination dial with delicate precision. 40 minutes, he murmured. Maybe less if I'm lucky. You have 15, Blackthorne said. Make your own luck. Porter went to work, his ear pressed against the door, fingers moving the dial in tiny increments. Elena and Blackthorne positioned themselves where they could watch both the stairs and Porter's progress. Time crawled. Every sound from the building above made Elena's breath catch. Was that Thomas returning early? Was that footsteps on the main floor? 10 minutes passed. Porter was sweating now, his usual calm cracking slightly as he worked faster than was probably safe. The dial spun left, then right, then left again in patterns Elena couldn't follow. 12 minutes. Footsteps above. Definitely footsteps, and they were getting closer. Someone's coming, Blackthorne whispered. Almost there, Porter hissed. Just need... A click. Soft but unmistakable. The vault door swung open. The footsteps above had reached the stairs. Thomas Welch's voice called down, "Who's there? Building's closed." "Get what you need," Blackthorne said to Elena. "Now." She rushed into the vault, scanning shelves lined with lockboxes and documents. Where would Mitchell keep her evidence? Not in plain sight, not labeled, not... There. A leather satchel shoved behind a row of ledgers. Brown, worn, with a broken clasp. Her satchel. Elena grabbed it, didn't bother checking the contents, just clutched it to her chest and turned to run. Thomas Welch appeared at the bottom of the stairs, lantern raised, his familiar face going from confused to shocked as he recognized her. "Miss Mercer, but you're wanted for..." "I'm innocent, Thomas. Mitchell framed me." Elena heard her own voice, desperate and raw. "Everything I said about the fraud was true. This satchel proves it." Thomas looked between Elena, Blackthorne, and the open vault. His hand moved to the pistol at his belt. I can't just let you rob the bank." "We're not robbing it. We're retrieving stolen evidence." Blackthorne's hand was on his own revolver, but he hadn't drawn it. Yet. "You know, Elena, you worked with her for 3 years. Do you really believe she murdered Victor Crane?" Thomas hesitated, clearly torn. "Mr. Mitchell said..." "Mitchell's the one who killed Victor. Mitchell's the one running the fraud scheme. Mitchell's the one who tried to have Elena killed and framed her to protect himself." Blackthorne's voice was steady, reasonable. "We can prove all of that with what's in that satchel, but only if you let us leave." "I could lose my job. I could be charged as an accomplice. Or you could be the guard who helped expose the biggest fraud case in territorial history." Elena took a step toward him. "Thomas, please. You knew Victor. You know he was a good man. Don't let his death be for nothing." The moment stretched impossibly thin. Thomas Welch, loyal employee and honest man, staring at 3 criminals who might be telling the truth. His hand stayed on his pistol. Then, slowly, he lifted it away. "I didn't see anything," he said quietly. "I made my rounds. Everything was secure. Came back, vault was closed, building was empty." He looked directly at Elena. "But if you're lying to me, if this really is just a robbery..." "It's not. I swear to you, it's not." Thomas nodded once and stepped aside. "Service entrance. Leave the way you came. And Miss Mercer, I hope you're right about all of it." They didn't wait for him to change his mind. Elena led them back through the building, clutching the satchel like it was the most precious thing in existence. Behind them, she heard Thomas securing the vault, resuming his rounds as if nothing had happened. The service entrance. The alley. The cold Denver night wrapping around them as they moved away from Rocky Mountain Trust as quickly as stealth allowed. Elena's lungs burned, her ribs aching from the exertion, but she didn't slow down until they were 6 blocks away and safely swallowed by darkness. "That was closer than I'd like," Porter said, his voice shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "That guard could have shot us, but he didn't." Blackthorne was already moving again. "Come on. We need to get these documents to Grayson before Mitchell realizes they're gone." They reached the small house to find Grayson pacing like an expectant father, Deputy Marshal Davis keeping watch outside. The federal inspector's face flooded with relief when they walked through the door. Thank whatever higher power you believe in. I was convinced you'd been arrested, or worse. Then he saw the satchel in Elena's hands. Is that everything I collected before they tried to kill me? Elena set it on the table, her hands finally steady now that they'd made it. Ledger copies, correspondence, transfer documentation. Everything you need to prove the fraud and tie it directly to Harrison Mitchell. Grayson opened the satchel with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. He pulled out page after page, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. Elena, this is extraordinary. The detail, the documentation. You built an entire case. Can you use it? Blackthorne asked. Legally? The way we obtained it is problematic, but as evidence in conjunction with everything else we're building, the old complaints, Pritchard's documents, the accounts we've traced through other institutions, this creates an undeniable pattern. Grayson looked up, and for the first time since Elena had met him, he was smiling. I can get warrants by morning, federal warrants, for Mitchell and everyone associated with the fraud. They won't see it coming. They will now, Elena said. Thomas Welch saw us at the bank. He let us go, but he'll have to report it eventually. Mitchell will know the evidence is gone. Then we move faster than he can respond. Grayson was already drafting notes, organizing documents. Davis, I need you to ride to the federal courthouse. Wake up Judge Harrison and tell him I need emergency warrants issued tonight. Multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, murder. Tell him it's the Rocky Mountain Trust case and that we finally have proof. Davis left at a run. Grayson continued working, building his case with the kind of focused intensity that had probably made him successful despite the political obstacles in his way. Blackthorne and Elena sat watching, too exhausted and too wired to do anything else. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we wait for the warrants. Then federal marshals arrest Mitchell and his associates before they can run or destroy anything else. You'll give a full deposition describing everything you witnessed. The documents will be authenticated and entered into evidence, and then... Grayson paused in his writing. And then we have a trial that's going to be watched by every newspaper in the territory and probably half the country. How long? Months? Maybe a year? These things move slowly through the legal system. He looked at her with something like sympathy. But you'll be under federal protection. No more hiding, no more running. Mitchell and his people won't be able to touch you. Dawn was breaking when the warrants arrived, delivered by Judge Harrison himself, along with 6 federal marshals armed and ready to execute them. Grayson reviewed the paperwork with the judge, pointing out key evidence, explaining the scope of the conspiracy. This is solid work, William, Harrison said. Ambitious, but solid. If even half of this holds up in court, you're talking about one of the largest fraud prosecutions in territorial history. It'll hold up, sir. We have multiple sources, documented evidence, eyewitness testimony from the inside. Mitchell's done. The marshals left to make their arrests. Elena wanted to go with them, wanted to see Mitchell's face when he realized everything was falling apart, but Grayson insisted she stay under protection. So she waited with Blackthorne in the small house, drinking coffee that had gone cold and bitter, listening for news. It came at midday. Deputy Marshal Davis returned with a report that made Elena's heart soar and sink simultaneously. We arrested Mitchell at his home. He's in federal custody, lawyered up already, but he's not talking. We also picked up Vanessa Hartley, 2 other bank officers, and 3 men from the syndicate whose names were in the correspondence. They're all claiming innocence or ignorance. Expected, Grayson said. What about the bank records? Were you able to secure them before anyone could destroy evidence? Federal team's going through everything now. It'll take weeks to sort, but initial assessment matches what Miss Mercer documented. The fraud's real, the scope is massive, and Mitchell's fingerprints are all over it. What about Victor Crane's murder? Elena asked. Can you prove Mitchell ordered it? Davis's expression turned grim. That's harder. No confession yet, no witnesses who'll testify. But we're working on it. Sometimes when people are facing decades in prison for fraud, they get cooperative about the murder charges, especially if cooperation means a lighter sentence. The trial, when it finally came 6 months later, was everything Grayson had predicted. Massive, public, and covered by every newspaper west of the Mississippi. Elena testified for 2 full days, recounting her discovery of the fraud, Mitchell's threats, the attack that had nearly killed her. Defense attorneys tried to shred her credibility, called her a disgruntled employee with a vendetta, suggested she'd fabricated evidence to cover her own theft. But the documents didn't lie. The numbers were irrefutable. And when Samuel Pritchard took the stand, pale and terrified but determined, corroborating everything Elena had said, the defense's strategy began to crumble. The turning point came when one of Mitchell's associates, facing a minimum 20-year sentence, agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. He described the syndicate's operations in detail, implicated Mitchell directly in Victor Crane's murder, and provided evidence of bribes paid to local officials to ignore complaints and suspicions. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, accessory to murder. Harrison Mitchell was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. His associates received similar sentences. The syndicate was dismantled, its assets seized to compensate victims. Elena stood in the courtroom as the sentences were read, feeling something she hadn't felt since before Victor died: vindicated. Not happy, exactly. Too much had been lost for happiness. But validated, proven right, believed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed with questions. Blackthorne handled them with practiced ease while Elena stood beside him, overwhelmed by the attention. One reporter asked what she'd do now that her name was cleared. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." But that wasn't entirely true. She'd been thinking about it for months, ever since the night they'd broken into the bank and proven that sometimes justice required breaking rules that protected the guilty. She'd been thinking about Blackthorne's question from that evening in the small house. What did she want? The answer had been forming slowly, built from shared danger and mutual respect, and the realization that she'd never met anyone quite like Sebastian Blackthorne. Difficult, principled, dangerous in all the ways that mattered when fighting monsters. After the trial concluded and the attention finally died down, Elena returned to Blackthorne Estate. Not as a fugitive seeking shelter, but as someone choosing where to be. Mrs. Hawthorne welcomed her back with characteristic efficiency, prepared a room in the main house without being asked, and acted like Elena's presence was the most natural thing in the world. Blackthorne found her in the library that evening, standing before the windows that overlooked the vast property. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, looking out at the empire he'd built. "I received the settlement today," Elena said quietly. "Compensation from the bank for wrongful dismissal and damage to my reputation. It's more money than I've ever seen." "Good, you earned it several times over." The territorial governor also issued a formal apology, offered me a position in the new Banking Oversight Commission they're forming to prevent future fraud. "Are you going to take it?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. The position was prestigious, well-paid, meaningful work that would use everything she'd learned. 6 months ago, she would have accepted immediately. But 6 months ago, she'd been a different person. Someone who believed institutions could protect people if they just functioned properly. Someone who thought following rules was the same as doing right. "No," she said finally. "I think I'm done with banks and bureaucracy. I'm interested in something else." "Which is?" "You have railroad interests, lumber operations, land development across 3 territories. She turned to face him. "You need someone who understands numbers, can spot fraud before it becomes a problem, and isn't afraid to fight when necessary." "I could do that. If the position's available." Blackthorne's expression was carefully neutral, but she saw something shift in his eyes. "You want to work for me?" "With you." "Partnership, not employment." Elena held his gaze. "You saved my life, helped me clear my name, risked everything to make sure justice happened. I could leave now, take my settlement money and start over somewhere else. Or I could stay and help you build something that actually matters. Wealth used as a weapon against the Harrison Mitchells of the world. Power deployed to protect people who can't protect themselves. That's an ambitious vision. I learned from someone ambitious." She smiled slightly. "So what do you think? Can you use a partner who's survived being beaten, framed for murder, hunted across 2 territories, and testified in the trial of the decade?" Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "I think anyone who survived all that and still believes in using power responsibly is exactly the kind of partner I need." Elena shook his hand, feeling the calluses that came from building an empire through actual work rather than theft. Then I accept. Good, because I'm expanding operations into Wyoming territory next month, and I'll need someone I trust to manage the financial oversight. The local banking situation is apparently corrupt as hell. Sounds perfect. What Elena didn't say, what neither of them acknowledged directly but both understood, was that the partnership was more than professional. That the bond forged through shared danger and mutual respect had deepened into something that looked remarkably like trust, and possibly like love, though neither was quite ready to name it yet. But they had time. Years, potentially, to figure out what they were to each other beyond allies in a fight against corruption. Time to build something together that was worth more than money. Legacy, purpose, a life defined by choices that mattered. Elena Mercer had started this journey as a bank clerk who noticed numbers that didn't add up and made the dangerous choice to pursue truth. She'd been beaten, abandoned, hunted, and framed. She'd survived because she was stubborn, and because a wealthy man with his own complicated principles had decided her life was worth saving. But she'd done more than survive. She'd fought back. She'd exposed corruption that had been hiding behind respectability for years. She'd helped send powerful criminals to prison. She'd proven that one person refusing to stay silent could change the outcome, even when the odds were impossible. And now, standing in Blackthorn Estate beside the man who'd become her unlikely ally, Elena understood something fundamental about wealth and power that she hadn't known before. They weren't inherently good or evil. They were tools, and their morality came from how you chose to use them. Mitchell had used his power to prey on the vulnerable. Blackthorn used his to fight back against predators. The difference wasn't in the amount of money or influence. It was in the choice to look at injustice and say no. Not on my watch, not while I have breath and resources to stop it. Elena had made that choice when she'd brought her suspicions to Victor Crane. She'd made it again when she'd refused to die on that trail. And she was making it now, choosing to stay and build something worth fighting for rather than walking away to safer, smaller dreams. "Thank you," she said quietly. Blackthorn glanced at her. "For what?" "For picking me up off that trail, for believing me when you had no reason to, for risking everything to make this right. You did the hardest part. I just provided resources and stubbornness." He paused. "But you're welcome, for whatever it's worth." They stood together as the sun set over Blackthorn Estate, painting the vast landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow they'd start planning the Wyoming expansion. Next week, Elena would begin reviewing Blackthorn's existing operations for inefficiencies and potential fraud. Next month, they'd tackle whatever new challenge presented itself. But tonight, they allowed themselves to simply exist in this moment. Two people who'd survived something impossible and chosen to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Outside, the territory stretched endlessly, full of corrupt officials and fraudulent schemes, and people who needed someone willing to fight for them. It was hard work, dangerous work, the kind that would probably get them both killed eventually. But it was worth doing, and that, Elena had learned, made all the difference. She'd left for dead on Ash Hollow Trail, and she'd come back from it stronger, sharper, unwilling to accept that power always won, and justice was just a pleasant fiction. Some stories ended with the heroine riding off into the sunset alone, free and independent. This one ended with Elena choosing to stay, to partner with someone as stubborn and principled as she'd become, to use the second chance she'd been given to make sure other people didn't have to fight alone. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real. And after everything she'd survived, real was more valuable than perfect could ever be. The dangerous game had ended. A new one was beginning, and Elena Mercer was ready for whatever came next.